The rain hit Seoul like a warning. Imani ran through it anyway, heels slipping on wet marble, a folder of contracts clutched to her chest like a shield. She was 12 minutes late for the biggest meeting of her career, in a city that had never once made her feel like she belonged in it, working for a man she'd never met but already feared. She didn't see the black car until it was almost too late. Tires screamed. A hand, strong, sudden, closed around her arm and yanked her back onto the curb a half-second before the car would have taken her legs out from under her. She stumbled into a chest that felt like a wall and looked up into a face carved from ice and command. Sharp jaw, dark eyes that missed nothing, rain sliding down skin like it didn't dare cling to him for long. "Watch where you're going," he said low, controlled, already letting her go like she'd burned him. "You could have killed me," she shot back, breathless, furious, alive in a way she hadn't been in months. He didn't answer. He just looked at her, really looked, the way no one in this city had bothered to, and something shifted behind his eyes, quick and involuntary, like a door he hadn't meant to open. Then his driver called his name, Kang Min-ho, and he turned and walked back into the storm like the moment had never happened. It had happened. She felt it in her chest for the rest of the day. She didn't know yet that Kang Min-ho owned the building she was walking into. That he was the reason her company had won the contract she was late to sign. That from the second his hand closed around her arm, something in him, something he'd spent 15 years burying under boardrooms and threats and blood he never let touch his hands directly, had woken up. She didn't know that men like him didn't forget women who made his pulse do something inconvenient. She would. Welcome to Afro Soul Stories. Please like, share and subscribe. The boardroom on the 40th floor of Kang Tower was silent except for the sound of rain against glass. Imani sat at the far end of the table, spine straight, folder open, doing her best to look like a woman who hadn't nearly died 40 minutes earlier. Then the doors opened and he walked in. Kang Min-ho in a dry suit now, hair pushed back, expression unreadable, except for the half-second flicker when he saw her sitting there. Recognition, then something colder, sharper, sliding over it like a mask clicking into place. "The negotiator from Everstone," he said, not a question. Imani Carter. She stood, offered her hand, refused to let it shake. "I believe we already met, informally." A murmur of confusion rippled through the other executives. He ignored it, shook her hand once, brief, deliberate, and sat at the head of the table like a man taking a throne. "Let's begin." She had prepared for weeks. She had not prepared for the way his attention pinned her to her seat, the way he asked questions that weren't really about the contract at all, testing her, watching her think. By the end of the meeting, Everstone had the deal, better terms than they'd asked for, and Imani had the distinct, unsettling sense that she'd just been claimed by something she didn't understand yet. The next day, a car was waiting outside her hotel. Not a taxi. A driver in a black suit holding a sign with her name on it, insisting Mr. Kang had arranged transportation for the duration of her stay. "I didn't ask for this," she told him. "Mr. Kang doesn't wait to be asked," the driver said, and opened the door she should have refused. She got in anyway. Later that night, she found a package at her hotel door, no card, no name, just a coat, the exact wool blue she'd admired in a shop window she thought no one had seen her stop at. She stood in the hallway holding it, heart doing something traitorous in her chest, and thought, "He's paying attention to me in a way that should terrify me and doesn't." A few days later, Everstone threw a dinner to celebrate the deal. Min-ho was there, seated across from her, silent through most of it, while a junior executive named David leaned in too close, laughed too loud at her jokes, put a hand on the back of her chair like he had a claim to stake. She watched Min-ho's jaw tighten. Watched his glass go still in his hand. He said nothing. He never had to raise his voice to make a room go cold, but when David reached for her hand across the table, Min-ho's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "MS. Carter has an early meeting," he said, standing. "I'll see her out." It wasn't a request. David's face went pale. Imani's pulse climbed for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Outside, the rain had started again. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "I know." He looked at her a long moment, something raw flickering under the control. "I didn't like watching him touch you." "That's not your right to decide." He agreed. "It isn't. I'm working on that." Honesty in it disarmed her more than any charm could have. By the end of the week, she'd learned things about him in fragments, that he ran half the skyline she worked under, that men lowered their eyes when he entered a room, that somewhere beneath the empire was a darker one nobody spoke of directly. She'd learned it from the way people flinched, from headlines that mentioned rival conglomerates and accidents, from the bodyguards who were never far from him even at dinner. She should have been afraid. Instead, she found herself standing in his office at midnight, having come to drop off signed documents, watching him work with his tie loosened and exhaustion carved into his face, and feeling something soften in her chest that she didn't have a name for. "You should go home," he said without looking up. "So should you." He looked up then. "I don't have anywhere I want to be more than here, apparently." A pause. That's a new problem for me. She sat down across from him instead of leaving. They talked, really talked about nothing important, about everything, until the couch in the corner of his office started to look less like furniture and more like a mistake she was too tired to avoid making. She didn't remember falling asleep. She remembered his voice low telling her to rest, and the warmth of a blanket that hadn't been there before, and the sound of him still working at his desk like he was standing guard over her sleep. She woke at 3 a.m. in a room that wasn't the couch, his private room, adjoining the office, dim light. His jacket draped over her like he'd carried her there and refused to leave without covering her first. He was in the doorway, watching her sit up, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I fell asleep in your room," she said, voice thick with sleep and disbelief. "You did." He didn't move from the doorway like he was giving himself a boundary he didn't entirely trust himself to keep. "I should apologize, I'm not sorry. Hart did something dangerous. Min-ho, go back to sleep, Imani." His voice was rough, careful, like a man holding something back with both hands. "I'll be right here." She lay back down. She didn't sleep again for a long time, not from fear, but from the strange, terrifying comfort of a dangerous man standing watch over her like she was something worth guarding. The following morning she woke alone, the room flooded with grey light, his jacket still around her shoulders. On the desk beside her sat a coffee, exactly how she took it, though she'd never told him, and a note in sharp, economical handwriting. "Meetings until noon. Don't let my assistant intimidate you." She smiled before she could stop herself. Then she caught her reflection in the window and the smile died a little, replaced by something more honest. Fear, not of him. Of how fast this was moving, how much of herself she was already handing over to a man whose world she didn't understand, whose enemies she hadn't met yet, whose softness toward her felt like it was carving out a space in his chest that had been empty and guarded for a long, long time. She didn't know yet what it would cost either of them. She was about to find out. A few days later, the first threat arrived, not to her directly, but to Everstone. A message, unsigned, warning the company to walk away from Kang Tower or watch the deal, and everyone attached to it, burn. Min-ho read it in his office with a stillness that frightened her more than any shout could have. "Who would do this?" she asked. "Someone who wants to hurt me," he said, "and has realized the fastest way to do that now is through you." The words landed like a confession neither of them had meant to make yet, that she mattered to him enough to be a target, that whatever was growing between them was no longer small enough to hide. "I'm not afraid of them," she said, though her voice shook. He crossed the room, tipped her chin up with 2 fingers, dark eyes burning with something fierce and unguarded. "Good, because I will burn every one of them to the ground before I let anything touch you." A pause, quieter. "I didn't plan on this, on you. I don't know how to want something this much and still play by the rules I've lived by my whole life." "Then don't," she whispered. The air between them went taut, charged, the kind of silence that precedes something neither person can take back. He didn't kiss her, not yet, but his forehead dropped to hers, both of them breathing like the moment itself was dangerous, and somewhere in that stillness, something impossible finished waking up in him for good. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Foreheads touching, breath shared, the threat still sitting on the desk behind them like a shadow neither wanted to acknowledge yet. Then Min-ho pulled back, jaw tight, control snapping back into place like armor. "I need to find out who sent that," he said. "Stay close to me until I do." "Is that an order?" "It's a fear," he admitted, quieter than she'd ever heard him. "I don't have many, I'm not used to having one with a name." The next morning, security around her tripled without her asking. A driver waited outside her hotel before she even reached the lobby. 2 men in dark suits trailed a respectful distance behind her at Everstone's offices. When she confronted him about it, he didn't apologize. "You think this is about control," he said, "isn't it? It's about not being able to survive if something happened to you." His voice cracked just slightly on the last word, the first true crack she'd seen in him. "I've buried people I loved because I wasn't fast enough. I won't do it again." She didn't ask who, not yet, but something in his face told her the empire he'd built wasn't just business. It was a fortress built by a man who'd lost too much to ever feel safe again. Later that week, they ended up at his penthouse, not planned, not calculated, just the natural gravity of 2 people who found excuses to be near each other. Rain again, always rain in this city, sheeting down the floor-to-ceiling windows while the lights of Seoul blurred into gold behind the glass. "Tell me about them," she said. "Whoever you lost." He poured 2 glasses of wine, sat across from her, and for the first time let the mask slip all the way. "My mother, my older brother, both taken from me by men who thought my father's empire was worth more than our lives." His hands, so sure of themselves in boardrooms, weren't steady now. "I was 17, I swore I'd never be powerless again, I built all of this." He gestured at the skyline, "so no one could ever take something from me like that again. Now there's you," he said, "and I've never been more afraid of losing anything in my life." Confession sat between them, raw and unguarded. She crossed the room without deciding to, sat beside him, and for once didn't try to talk herself out of what she felt. I'm scared too, she admitted. Of you, of this. Of how much I already, she stopped. He said, voice rough, of how much I already need you to be careful with me. His hand came up to her face, slow, reverent, like she was something he still couldn't quite believe was real. I will spend the rest of my life being careful with you, he murmured, if you let me try. Kiss that followed wasn't rushed. It was the kind that undid something in both of them, years of walls in him, months of guarded distance in her, collapsing quiet and complete. The city lights blurred gold beyond the window. Neither of them noticed the rain anymore. What happened after belonged only to them. Low words, trembling hands, the slow unraveling of two people who had spent their whole lives being strong for everyone but themselves, finally letting go in the dark, wrapped around each other like the storm outside couldn't touch them there. When morning came, it came softly, tangled in blankets, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing slow circles on her shoulder like he was afraid that if he stopped touching her, she'd disappear. She woke before he did. Lay there a long moment, listening to his heartbeat, and felt panic climb up her throat instead of peace. This is too much, too fast. He is too powerful, too dangerous, and I am too breakable for a world like his. She thought of the threat on his desk, of the bodyguards, of a man who had buried his own mother and brother because of who he was. She thought, if I stay, I become a person worth killing to hurt him. Stay, and he ever looks at me the way he looked at that report, like I'm already gone, I won't survive it. She slipped out from under his arm, dressed in the grey half-light, and left before he woke, telling herself it was self-preservation and feeling with every step toward the door like she was tearing something out of her own chest. By midday, he'd realized she was gone, not just from the penthouse, but from Everston's offices, her phone unreachable, her hotel room emptied of her things. He stood in the middle of his office, stillness turning to something colder, sharper, more dangerous than she'd ever seen in him. Find her, he told his head of security. Now, sir, if she left on her own, I don't care why she left. His voice didn't rise, it didn't have to. Find her before I do something none of you will be able to stop. Onto ground in a small guest house on the edge of the city, telling herself she needed space to think, ignoring the 17 missed calls on her phone, the single text that undid her more than any of the calls could have. I'm not angry, I'm terrified. Please let me know you're safe, that's all I'm asking. She was still staring at it when someone knocked on the guest house door, not him. A stranger, polite, official-looking, claiming to be from Everston's legal department with papers she needed to sign. She should have called to verify, she didn't. The moment she opened the door, 2 more men stepped out from the hallway behind him, and she understood with a cold drop in her stomach exactly who had found her first. MS. Carter, the lead man said almost gently, Mr. Kang's enemies have been very patient, you've made this so much easier than we expected. She didn't get the chance to scream before a cloth pressed over her mouth and the world went dark. Min-ho got the call 20 minutes later. A photo sent to his private line, Imani unconscious in the back of an unmarked van with a single message beneath it. Walk away from the Osun Port deal or we send her back to you in pieces. You have until midnight. Something in him that had been holding steady for 15 years, since the night he stood over his brother's body and swore he'd never be powerless again, finally broke loose completely. He didn't shout. He didn't smash anything. His voice when he spoke was quieter than his men had ever heard it and twice as terrifying. Get me everyone, he said. Every man I have, every favor I'm owed, every enemy of the Osun syndicate who's been waiting for a reason to move against them. His eyes were black glass, unreadable, absolute. Tonight, I burn their entire operation to the ground, and I want them to know exactly why and exactly who took her from me. By nightfall, Seoul's underworld was quietly, violently rearranging itself. Warehouses that had stood untouched for a decade fell in hours. Alliances Min-ho had spent years cultivating in the shadows, favors he'd never called in, debts he'd never collected, were spent all at once, ruthlessly, for one purpose only. He found the location himself, a shipping facility on the city's edge, half-lit, guarded by men who hadn't expected the full weight of Kang Min-ho's empire to descend on them in a single night. He walked through the wreckage of what used to be a stronghold with a calm that was more frightening than rage, until he found the room where they'd left her, still unconscious, bound to a chair. He didn't wait for his men. He crossed the room himself, hands shaking for the first time in years as he cut her free, cradling her against his chest like she was the only fragile thing left in a world he'd just torn apart to reach her. Imani, his voice cracked her name in half. Imani, wake up please, her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, then found his face. Min-ho, I'm here, he said, forehead pressed to hers, breathing her in like proof she was real. I'm here, I have you, I will always come for you. Do you understand me? always. She started to cry, relief, fear, everything she'd been running from finally catching up to her at once, and he held her through it, right there in the ruins of the men who'd taken her, refusing to let go, even to let the medics through until she asked him to. The next morning, in a private hospital room, guarded by 4 of his men, she finally told him the truth she'd been too afraid to say before she left. "I ran because I was scared," she admitted, voice hoarse. "Not of you, of how much power you have over how I feel. I thought if I stayed I'd become something you'd lose, and I couldn't survive being loved by you and losing you both at once." He took her hand, pressed it to his lips, eyes darker and more open than she'd ever seen them. "You listen to me," he said. "You are not something I could lose easily. I tore apart an empire in one night to bring you back. I will do it again and again for as long as I live, because losing you was never something I was willing to survive." A pause. "Raw, don't run from me again, not because I'll be angry, because I don't know what's left of me if you do." "I won't," she whispered. "I promise." Outside the window, dawn was breaking over Seoul, gold light finally cutting through days of rain, the first clear sky the city had seen in a week. A few days later, the story broke anyway, not the parts he'd managed to bury, but enough of it. Whispers that Kang Min-ho had gone to war over a foreign woman from Everstone. Reporters camped outside Kang Tower. Board members who had spent years pretending not to know about the empire beneath his empire suddenly found their courage to ask questions. Imani, released from the hospital, found him in his office that evening staring at a stack of headlines with an expression she couldn't read. "They know," she said. "They know I'll burn the world down for you," he said. "Let them print that. I'm done hiding what you mean to me to protect a reputation I built out of grief instead of love." He turned to face her fully, something resolved and unshakable in his eyes. "I called a press conference for tomorrow morning." "To say what?" "The truth." He crossed the room, took both her hands in his. "That I am not ashamed of what I did to bring you home, that I am not ashamed of loving you. That anyone who comes near you again will learn exactly what's left of a man who has already lost everything twice, and refuses to lose it a third time." She should have been afraid of what that kind of honesty would cost him. Instead, she felt something settle in her chest for the first time since she'd arrived in this city, the sense of finally being chosen, completely, without conditions. The next morning, the press conference filled every seat in Kang Tower's atrium. Cameras rolling, board members flanking him with tight, uncertain faces, Min-ho stood at the podium with a calm that silenced the room before he'd said a single word. "3 days ago," he began, "men connected to a rival syndicate kidnapped a woman I love to punish me for who I am." A ripple moved through the crowd. "I dismantled their operation in a single night to bring her home safely. I will not apologize for that, and I will not pretend the empire my family built doesn't have a darker foundation than the one you see in our annual reports." He paused, found Imani standing at the edge of the room, and something in his face softened even as his voice stayed steady. "What I will say is this: I spent 15 years building walls around myself so nothing could ever be taken from me again. Imani Carter walked through every one of them without trying. She is the reason I remembered what it felt like to have something worth protecting instead of just something worth owning." His eyes didn't leave hers. "I love her. Publicly, completely, without conditions. Anyone who has a problem with that can bring it to me directly." Room erupted, questions, cameras, chaos, but Imani heard none of it. She only saw him step down from the podium, cross the room in a way that made every guard and executive part like water, and stop in front of her like the rest of the world had simply ceased to exist. "I meant every word," he said quietly, just for her. "I know," she whispered. "I heard all of it." He kissed her then in front of the cameras, the board, the whole city that had spent a week whispering about them, slow and certain, like a man finally putting down a weight he'd carried since he was 17 years old. By the end of the month, the syndicate that had taken her was gone, not just from Seoul, but from any city where Min-ho's reach extended, which by then was most of them. Everstone's deal closed, stronger than ever, with Imani promoted to lead the very partnership that had brought her into his orbit in the first place. The headlines shifted slowly from scandal to something closer to fascination. The untouchable Kang Min-ho, finally touched by something he refused to let go of. They moved slower after that, deliberately, dinners that weren't interrupted by threats, mornings that weren't shadowed by fear, a version of love neither of them had let themselves imagine before. He still kept guards close. He still checked his phone too fast when she was 5 minutes late to anything. But the fear in his eyes had changed shape. No longer the fear of a man who expected to lose everything, but the fear of a man who finally had too much to lose and was determined, every single day, to protect it properly instead of desperately. 6 months later, on a night with no rain at all, the first dry evening Seoul had given them since the day they met, he took her to the rooftop garden of Kang Tower, city lights spread out beneath them like something they'd both fought to earn. "Do you remember the first night you fell asleep in my room?" he asked. "I remember being terrified of how safe I felt," she said. "Been terrified of exactly one thing since that night," he said, and got down on one knee, a small velvet box steady in hands that had once shaken tearing through a warehouse to save her life. "Losing the only place I've ever actually wanted to come home to. Marry me, Imani. Let me spend the rest of my life being the man who protects your peace instead of the one who almost cost you your safety." She was crying before she managed to say yes, crying the way she had in his arms in that ruined warehouse, except this time it was only relief, only joy, only the astonishing, impossible feeling of being loved completely by a man who had once seemed built entirely of danger. A year later, their wedding filled the same atrium where he'd once stood in front of cameras and refused to be ashamed of loving her. Her family flew in from home. His board stood beside men who months earlier had been strangers guarding her hospital door. Min-ho, in the middle of vows he'd written and rewritten a dozen times, finally said the truest thing he'd ever said in that building full of contracts and quiet violence. "I built an empire to make sure nothing could be taken from me again. I didn't understand until you that the only thing worth protecting that fiercely was a home. You're my home, Imani. You have been since the night you fell asleep somewhere you were never supposed to feel safe enough to rest." Nearly 2 years after a car had almost taken her life on a rain-soaked street, Imani sat in the nursery of the penthouse that had once felt like a stranger's fortress and now felt like the only place in the world she wanted to be. One hand resting on the curve of her stomach, watching Min-ho argue quietly and fiercely with a paint swatch, determined that their daughter's room be exactly right. "You know she won't care what color the walls are," Imani said, laughing. "I care," he said without looking up, "because everything in her world is going to be exactly as safe and as loved as I can make it. Starting now." She watched him, the man the city still called untouchable, still feared in boardrooms and back alleys alike, kneel on the floor of a nursery, utterly undone by the small, fierce love he'd built his whole broken, dangerous life toward without knowing it. And she understood, finally and completely, that the night she'd accidentally fallen asleep in his room hadn't been an accident at all. It had been the beginning of the only home either of them had ever really had.